Good evening. Well, this is the last day of classes. That is coming up on Tuesday. But I wanted to record this video a little bit earlier so that you can actually work also on your final exam, because you need to finish chapter 10 in order to start working on the final exam. Chapter 10, day 10, right? So said, let's finish this one, and you say I have more time for the final exam, which is on Wednesday. We need to have everything done by Wednesday by midnight. So anyways, that's it. We have several of ideas here. First of all, I have Norman Vincent Peale, and he's interesting figure. He was a minister here in New York City and the founder of positive thinking. He was also a minister to Richard Nixon. Privately, they were friends, and Nixon attended his church. Richard Nixon actually lived in New York for the most time after his resignation. And the reason he is in here is this coalition which Ronald Reagan put together. And this was a very new coalition in American politics. It was a coalition of well, traditionally. Now, don't take this to mean in every instance, but this was the rule of thumb. Republican Party was a Protestant party, a conservative Protestant party in American history. And Democrats were a liberal party of liberal Protestants. And and therefore a lot of Catholics, regardless of whether those are conservative Catholics or liberal Catholics or you name it, Italian Catholics, Irish Catholics, German Catholics, they mostly voted for Democrats because the Republican Party was a Protestant party. So anyways, but this started to change in the 20th century, and eventually it changed dramatically under Reagan. When Ronald Reagan made a coalition between the evangelical Protestants, traditional conservative Protestants, and conservative Catholics, and that involved mostly Polish Catholics who are traditional and very very anti-communist. They were. So anyways, so Norman Vincent Peale is an example of this evangelical support of Ronald Reagan. The next one that we have here is Gorbachev, Mikhail Gorbachev. That's another interesting figure related to the presidency of Ronald Reagan. One of the interesting things is that Ronald Reagan mostly talked a lot during his life about communism and the dangers of communism in the United States. But he was mostly interested in dismantling the New Deal economics. That was a consensus from the 1930s all the way into the 1970s. And therefore, I insisted that you cover these various economic theories, John Maynard Keynes and Milton Friedman, and there were a couple of other people here related to Ronald Reagan's economic theory called the supply side economics. So Mikhail Gorbachev became a leader of the Soviet Union during the presidency of Ronald Reagan, and came as a total surprise. Nobody expected it, not even Reagan, who was hoping that there would be a change of course in the Soviet Union and so on and so forth. But this was totally unpredictable, which is an indication how little we know, how little we knew and how little we know now about Russia. And to a surprise of many, in particular the left wing and communists here in the United States and outside and in the other places, in Europe and so on and so forth, that he openly admitted that the communist system is in trouble. And what was in trouble was the system of economic planning, which was introduced in the 1930s, parallel to what was going on with the New Deal, of government control of the economy. And therefore, Mikhail Gorbachev suggested two remedies: glasnost, which meant democratization. We would translate that as democratization. It means, openly expressing your opinion, which wasn't something that was practiced in the Soviet Union. And perestroika, which means change. And that change was the change in the economy. Change towards a more free market oriented system. And that came as a huge surprise to the whole of the West. Nobody expected that the Soviet Union, who actually at the beginning of Reagan's presidency, under Jimmy Carter, Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in order to prevent Islamic fundamentalists from taking over that country. And nobody expected that within the matter of years, Mikhail Gorbachev would make the Soviet Union leave Afghanistan and undertake such a systemic and radical amount of reforms in the Soviet Union that the whole world was taken by a complete surprise. Anyways, so that's that much about Mikhail Gorbachev. Now, even though number 3, Arthur Laffer, is and Paul Walker, these two are economic advisors of Ronald Reagan, and had a very important role in the formulation of this new economic policy that is known as the supply side economics. Oh, anyways. So what is this supply side economics? It's exactly the opposite of Keynesianism. Keynesianism says that economic crises come as the demand drops. People don't have money, there is no demand for goods, and therefore the economic production goes down. And in order to stimulate the economy, government should actually increase the demand, and that is give more people tools and jobs, so that they can go on the market and buy stuff and therefore increase economic activity. This supply side economics is very, very different. The problem with the system that was introduced by Maynard Keynes and was practiced for years and years throughout the world was taxation. And that's where Arthur Laffer comes in, who was an economist and who pointed out that, well, you start increasing taxes. This was his observation. You start increasing taxes. And as you increase taxes, you collect more revenue as the government. And there is a certain point, and that is this Laffer curve, where you can increase taxes as much as you want to, but you're not going to increase revenue. So in other words, people are going to find a way out to dodge the taxes. because and therefore you can up to a certain point, and the debate of then was, of course, okay, can you determine what is that point, but at which you get maximum effect from taxation. So with the least amount of taxes, you collected the most money, and this was a shocker to a lot of people. Famously, the vice president, who was a counter candidate to Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, called this voodoo economics. It wasn't voodoo economics. It was Arthur Laffer was a famous economist who made a name by this discovery, and for the first time since New Deal, there were some examples of cutting taxes before, but this was not done in a systematic way. Now, under Reagan and following this logic of Arthur Laffer, the idea was that if you actually cut taxes, you would increase revenue. And, well, did it work? Who knows? Economists still debate this issue. So anyways, but it stimulated the economic growth, because cutting taxes meant that the people had more money and they were willing to invest that money, and therefore economic growth pick up. And the fourth one is Paul Walker, who was the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, and who was responsible for getting rid of inflation in the United States. Inflation at one point almost reached 20% on an annual basis. And it was fairly awful, because inflation is actually a tax. That means that government is stealing from you by printing money. And so the prices of everything go up and up, and your salary doesn't follow, and therefore it is as if you've been taxed. And the worst part about inflation is that the poorest people are mostly affected, the most vulnerable, not the rich people who could dodge inflation by investing in real estate and in gold and something of that sort, but actually people who live paycheck to paycheck. So Paul Walker, who was actually appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank under Jimmy Carter, he was a New Jerseyan, by the way. And anyways, he raised the interest rates. And that's the prime rate. That's the rate at which the Federal Reserve Bank lends the money to commercial banks. And then the commercial banks lend the money to, you and me, or everybody who is interested in taking credit. And he raised that rate almost to 20%, which means that nobody could borrow money at that crazy rate. And the effect was harsh. The first 2 years of Reagan were very, very painful, economically speaking. But that's the remedy for inflation. That's how you crush inflation. And inflation, within the matter of a year or two, dropped from 20 to about 3%, which is manageable, which is where it stayed. And so this was quite a shock for the economists to see somebody willing to do so. The high interest rate inflict pain on people, and reducing the money supply, and therefore it's a very, very rough medicine. But it was implemented with the support from from the Federal Reserve and from the president, who reappointed Paul Walker, and it worked. And we didn't have the inflation from the 1980s till these days today. So that's a good 40 years. 40 years of very, very low or non-existent inflation. And it only popped up now, again. And again, if you want to get out, if we want to get out it, it's going to be painful. So brace yourselves. And anyways, finally we have number 5, Rambo, the movie series. Rambo was, anyways, a fun movie series about played by Sylvester Stallone, a veteran from Vietnam, who did everything right and was abused by the system, and then he comes back here to the United States, and there is a whole sort of series. And oh gosh, Rambo was symbol of this new macho America. That's not exactly true. First, it was an attempt to heal the wound of Vietnam. Vietnam was a bitter defeat for the United States, especially a lot of people who were drafted, who were sent over to fight, and then who came here and who were abused and by anti-war protesters, and they were not really understood. So anyways, this movie series Rambo, which the first one is the best, and then it gets, of course, as is any movie series, and then it gets worse and worse. It was an attempt to, and this is very symbolic of Ronald Reagan's policy, attempt to get over Vietnam and look at America not as a failure, a country of failure in Vietnam, but as a successful country. So anyways, just to give you an idea of what were the 80s like. So that's our ideas for today. We have, I'm looking at the quiz now, and one of the big issues, during the war of Vietnam were draft dodging. It's estimated probably 50,000 people actually left for Canada. That was the most popular destination. But people, left went to other countries to avoid being drafted in Vietnam. And then the issue, of course, was of pardon, whether or not these people would be, pardoned, or should they be pardoned, and so on and so forth. And Gerald Ford's administration, after Nixon resigned, was kind of reluctant to do it. And then Jimmy Carter, when he came to office, he followed through on the promise that he made during the campaign. Finally, we have, stagflation, this idea that we talked about a lot. 4 pillars of Reagan's economic policy: reduce the growth of government spending, reduce the federal income tax and capital gains tax, reduce government regulation, and tighten the money supply in order to reduce inflation. It was simple. Reagan famously said, government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. And American people understood it. That's why Reagan was called the great communicator. He was able to communicate very complex issues in a very, very simple way, and people listened to it. And you have a couple of people here among the evangelical Protestants who were a backbone of the Reagan coalition. USSR invasion of Vietnam, Afghanistan. What else do we have? Right. A little bit about question number 6 and this idea of conservatism in American politics. As I said, this is a relatively new phenomenon. That's why it's called Reagan Revolution. In the sense that, If you look at the origins of our country, way back to, US History 1, when we talked about, well, maybe you haven't taken it with me, but with somebody else. Conservatism is, people who believe in tradition, right? And by definition, the United States is not a conservative country. It originated in a revolution against tradition. So conservatives were for the king. And therefore, throughout American history, there was no real conservative movement up until the 1950s. And that happened here in New York. Actually, there were a couple of people here who were thinking about those things, including William Buckley and so on and so forth. And they wanted to come up with a new ideology that would actually stand as a barrier towards greater and greater modernization of the country. Progressivism. And progressive ideology is, as you've seen in this course, was something that was popular both among the Democrats and Republicans. So very often we look at, Teddy Roosevelt, the Republican, and Woodrow Wilson as a Democrat. Both are progressives. And progressivism is an interesting ideology. It's every day in every way I'm becoming a better and better person. So there is this idea of, that we're getting better and better every day. There are more rights, everything is improving, and so on and so forth. And conservatives didn't like that. And therefore the pivotal moment was this election of Barry Goldwater, who combined libertarian ideas with conservative ideas. And Reagan was there. He made a famous speech, A Time for Choosing. And anyways, Barry Goldwater lost those elections. This was the election after President Kennedy was assassinated, so even the best of candidates had no chance against the sitting Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson. But anyways, that's the beginning of modern conservatism in the Republican Party. And that sort of stays with us still today. Okay, you have this famous saying of Reagan, in government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. All right. Another famous saying of Ronald Reagan, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. I want you to have a look at the wall and a little bit of the geography of the wall, what it meant, how it worked, when it was built, when it was dismantled. It was dismantled in 1989 after George Herbert Walker Bush became next president after Ronald Reagan. So anyways, again, stagflation, this important idea, Rambo, okay. Music, television, right. Well, one of the things that was advocated under this supply side economics was the liberalization of news media. And this became a big deal. In many countries, there were in America there were 3 big networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, and that was it. They were not state-run companies, but they were probably worse than state-run companies. There were big corporations in the way, there were 3 great networks and there were 3 auto manufacturers. And this is what you have. You can buy a Chevy, you can buy a Ford, and you can buy a Chrysler, Plymouth, Dodge. And there were no good choices there. So what happened in newspaper business and in media business is that new venues started to appear. And here included was MTV, one of the new media conglomerate channels that eventually became a conglomerate and so on and so forth. And anyways, but the same thing happened in the auto industry. Suddenly Japanese cars started showing up on American streets, and now more Americans drive Toyotas and Hondas than they drive Chevys and Fords. And Chevy and Ford were not these pampered, protected companies who, whenever something goes wrong, they would go to the government and ask for a loan to get out of trouble. But they have to compete actually on the free market. And that means jobs were lost. But overall, Americans were happy because those American cars made in Detroit in the 70s were clunkers. Those were awful, awful cars. So anyways, when Japanese cars showed up, people just jumped on the opportunity because they were, they were good, they were long lasting, and they were not, fancy schmancy, but they were great things to get you to work and back. So anyways, we have also the problems in Eastern Europe, which Gorbachev was dealing with, especially, what was very embarrassing for the communist side was the appearance of the Solidarity trade union movement in Poland. That started in the 1980s, and they received support from the Polish Pope, and they were a contradiction in terms, right? Socialist system is supposed to be for the worker, and apparently the workers in the socialist system were not happy. So the workers wanted to organize a trade union to protect them from the socialist system, which is there and which is implemented in that country for their own benefit. So it tells you that something was wrong, right? And so there was a lot of things going on. The martial law was introduced in Poland. It became obvious that Polish people don't like the regime, the communist regime under which they were living. And finally came Gorbachev and said, well, I can't force you to like it, which was a reasonable thing to do. Anyways, we have chairmen of the Federal Reserve Bank. More questions. There is an example of Lee Iacocca, who, example of this attitude of great corporations in America, who were, as I said, not really under state ownership, but whenever there was a problem, they were too big to fail, and therefore they would run to Washington and ask Congress for loan guarantees. And for those loan guarantees, these companies would give shares of the company to the state, and the state would order then Dodge or Ford trucks to be bought by the U.S. military and things of that sort. And it was a very, very bad system. The system was not working. So anyways, you have an example of this stagflation economy that brought about Ronald Reagan and his supply side economics. Anyways, okay, more questions about supply side economics. Pope and the Vatican City. Interestingly enough, there was an attempted assassination of both the Pope and Ronald Reagan. First, Ronald Reagan was shot on March 30th, and then Pope was shot on 13th of May in 1981. There was a lot of speculation, like who did it, like as is always the case. In the case of the Pope, it turns out that There might be some connection there with the Bulgarian Secret Service, so therefore, to the communist bloc, but maybe not. We don't know. He came from Turkey, and he was actually very active in the various Palestine liberation movements and so on and so forth. Ahmed Ali Agha. So, anyways, the interesting things that you should know about. And finally, the elections of 1984 and the landslide, the second term of Ronald Reagan, was extremely popular president. There has been no such popular president since New Deal. Roosevelt won victories in this range with the 60% of the popular vote. And that's what that'll be, his second election, his re-election campaign. That was a landslide of Roosevelt. So, anyways, it tells you that this was a pivotal moment in American history. And finally, the idea of Rust Belt. This new system of supply side economic was not for the squeamish. It meant that if Ford or Chrysler or General Motors is making bad cars and Toyota is making good cars, let them go bankrupt. See, they can't compete. They're not really worth preserving. And Toyota and Honda opened automobile factories here in the United States. And they became not just imported cars, but they became American-made cars. And so this was rough for a lot of people in the Midwest. A lot of industries, the industrial heartland of America, was devastated. Devastated. And this is still going on. A lot of people in the Midwest who work in those, take Detroit and the big three automobile manufacturing, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. They reduced the number of employees, and a lot of people were sent home. And these people still, to this day, are not sure who to blame. Should we blame the Republicans or Democrats? And there is enough blame to go around, and it makes for very, very volatile politics that we live in today. So that's about it about chapter 29. We're not going to go further. Other significant things that was 9/11 thing, but anyways, most of you either remember it or are kind of close enough to know what it means. But this debate, economic debate, that we kind of sketched out here in this course between Keynesianism and the supply side economics is something that is still at the heart of American politics right now. So not much has changed. So that's about it. I'll just conclude this one here and post it so you have it before Tuesday, even though Monday is Martin Luther King Day, so we have no classes, but we'll see each other on Tuesday and Wednesday, and we'll talk about the final exam and everything else that is left. All right, so that's it. 29, Reagan Revolution, and see you on Tuesday. Bye.